Welcome to the Faith Today podcast, conversations inspired by Canada's Christian magazine.
I'm Karen Stiller. Jen Pollock Michel is a Toronto-based writer who is one of my favorites. She also hosts the Englewood Review of Books podcast, which I commend to you, especially if you're a book lover. We've had her in the pages of Faith Today, and we need to do that again soon. Jen's books so far are Teach Us to Want, Longing, Ambition, and the Life of Faith, and Keeping Place, Reflections on the Meaning of Home, and most recently, Surprised by Paradox, The Promise of And in an Either-Or World. And actually, all three of those books are so relevant for the times we find ourselves in right now. I spoke with Wise Jen, that's what I'm going to call her, I think, about Lament, how to have truly good conversations, and what to do when people think you are a Christian weirdo, and a whole bunch of other things. And the truth is, I could have talked to her all day. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I do. So Jen, I have read each of your books. I realized that today when I was going back to make sure I had my Jen research done. And I was like, yeah, I have read all of her books and I loved each of them. I think your work is solid and beautiful. That's how I would describe it to someone who didn't know you.
Oh, well, the admiration is absolutely mutual, Karen. I so loved your memoir, The Minister's Wife, and it felt the exact same thing. Felt it was so honest and beautiful.
Wow, thank you. I
hmm
appreciate that. Your most recent book, Surprised by Paradox, The Promise of And in an Either-Or World. I was thinking it is particularly relevant now. I mean, it came out pre-pandemic. You couldn't have
Mm,
known
no.
what was coming, but you do spend considerable time on lament. And obviously, lament is a perfect word, I think, for what so many of us are doing right now. And I wondered if you could speak to that, first of all, just the role of lament in the Christian life right now, even.
Yeah, lament is the both and of both, being able to name honestly our disappointments, our sadness, our anger, our doubt, naming all of that, not just in the interior spaces of our mind and soul, but naming it to God and, trusting, hoping, believing that He's working all things together for good. And I feel like the power of lament is its honesty and its hope, just holding those two things in tension. And I think a lot of times as Christians, we don't like to hold things in tension. It feels really uncomfortable. It feels far more comfortable to just say kind of nice platitudes like God's working all things together for good, and that, and paste a smile on our face. And we sort of feel like that's the act of faith, right? Is, to definitely not impugn God's reputation. Don't ever suggest that anything is really wrong or bad in the world or in our lives. But I feel like lament just offers us such a better way, a way that is far more honest. And I think until we get honest with God and with ourselves, like there's really no possibility for transformation. And it is such a moment. I think lament is required in so many different ways, right now in this moment. And even just in the midst of a pandemic, to be able to say, yeah, God, I do trust that you're working some invisible good plan that I can't see. But I also have to say this is hard. This is lonely. I was even just writing in my journal today. I think one of the hardest parts about it is it feeling like a liminal space, kind of like not the before and not the after, just the in between. And it's sort of the endless in between. It's just the enduring quality of the in between. You don't know when it ever will be after. And I just think that intimacy with God, I think lament is an invitation to be intimate with God, who already knows. I mean, we all know He knows. If He knows, a word before we speak it, He knows everything that, goes on inside of us. And so it's not as if He doesn't know. I think the act of naming it is the act that draws us close to Him.
Yes. And he knows that we know that he knows.
That's right.
As you were speaking, I was thinking about your first book, Teach Us to Want, Longing, Ambition, and the Life of Faith. And that book, which is how I discovered you, that book helped me be more okay with my wanting. actually. And so there's an honesty required there too, when we can be honest and transparent about what we want and need to God and with each other. And I love that idea of honesty between believers, but also in how we speak to people who may not believe. In being honest that, yeah, I do not have it all together. And actually, I'm really, annoyed or depressed or sad or whatever about where we are right now in our life.
Mm-hmm. I actually think I was saying to a friend recently, I said, if I were to summarize like the last 10 years of my spiritual journey, it would be like the embracing the invitation to being a human being,
Oh,
with all of the fallibilities and imperfections and, flaws and well intentions, good intentions too, being a human on the road with God, that is a both and, right? To kind of the sinner saint experience. And so I think that as the church, I think the world would rather us offer a picture of what it means to be human in relationship with God than what it means to be superhuman in relationship with God. I think a lot of times we have this idea that we have to be superhuman. We have to be sort of invincible, impervious to doubt or sadness, or some of these more difficult. Maybe we just feel ashamed of those kinds of emotions in the life of faith, and maybe we feel that would not bear witness to the hope that we have as Christians. But I really do believe that people who are watching Christians would rather have honesty than kind of religious sentiment that feels so hollow and empty. When I live a very human life in front of my neighbors, a life that looks like, I yell at my kids. Sometimes my neighbors are going to hear me yell at my kids, especially as I'm getting them in the car in the morning to go to school. Like that's not something I'm proud of. But to be able to say, I am human and I'm learning that God actually receives me in my humanness. We're all
yeah.
really afraid that God wouldn't receive us in our humanness. If we could live that example, I think that'd be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm so glad you said you yell at your kids. I have been heard to do that. And actually, I remember once this is when we lived in the rectory, which is the house beside the church that my husband was pastoring. And it was a Sunday morning. And I yelled at my daughter, get ready or whatever. And then I noticed her bedroom window was open. And I went and peeked. I peeked out, and there was an older woman from our church literally looking up at my daughter's window. And I said, Holly, stop that yelling.
You
Isn't
did
that
not. I
terrible?
love it.
It
I love
is
it.
terrible. I totally did. So speaking of church, because I love how you write and think about church, like local church. I mean,
Hmm.
you clearly belong to a congregation. You go, you attend, you're involved. And sometimes that's not easy either. And that's definitely an opportunity for us to be honest with each other and real. So I'd love for you to speak about the role of church, especially because I think there is a risk where so many of us haven't been attending in person, that some of us may not go back. And
Mm.
I think that would be a shame.
I think it would be a real shame. I think there's such a seduction, to thinking that we can sort of figure out our spiritual lives on our own. There's just this like brute individualism, that's rampant through our culture, and it just bleeds into our spiritual life. Like we think a lot of our spiritual disciplines is these like things that we practice in quiet by ourselves in solitude. And we just don't grant that church is really, gosh, I almost want to say the most important part. I mean, I don't know if we could. I just think if you read the Bible, there's no way to understand your identity as God's child without understanding your identity as part of the people of God. That God's gathering to himself a people. He's called a people to himself out of the world, to bear witness to his love. And I mean, church for me is practically where absolutely everything works out. I can put a whole bunch of nice sentences on a page, but the rubber meets the road when, and I'll just give an example, last week, it looks like having a conversation over about political differences with a brother and sister in Christ and moving toward them, not, and saying like, this really matters. It really matters that we're in relationships with each other. It really matters that we can have these conversations that are hard and that actually bear out disagreement. But it really matters that we walk away from that conversation committed, even more committed to each other. And so for me, church is just like, it is like I guess it's like when you think about getting into the field, if you're a researcher or something, you can be in your laboratory, working out whatever you're studying. But it's actually when you get in the field, you see if those things really, if those principles and ideas that you've worked out in the lab, like, do they work in real life? And for me, church is the real life of faith. It's relationships, it's disagreement, it's conflict, it's encouragement. I mean, I don't want to, I would certainly never want to say that church is all the hard stuff. It's beautiful stuff too. And moving toward church for me in this season has been a huge part of thinking about how to survive the pandemic. I mean, that doesn't look like gathering together in person on Sunday. But I guess the question I've been asking myself is, how can I move toward my community of faith? Because I won't survive this without them. And I don't know that they'll survive this without me. And so that's even looked like this fall. Just because all of my travel is canceled, I get to lead a small group at my church. And that's kind of a new thing for me in this season. But again, another way that I'm like practically working out what I say I believe. I say I believe that church is foundational to being part of the people of God. So I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. And I actually signed up to lead a small group.
Yeah, I really love that. And I love that you said how thinking about how church would survive without you.
Mm,
Because I think that's something we don't consider sometimes when we don't show up, that we actually uh, we give something, we contribute something, we are important to our church, and we matter, and we can make a difference in other people's lives. Like I think that's such a kind of subtle but really important point to make.
I mean, that's even part of the conversation that I had with my friends last week, of talking about political differences. It was the point that I wanted to sort of bring and into that conversation was that I love you and I respect you and I want this relationship to go forward. But oh, I would be so sad if you weren't at our church anymore. Like, if
Mm,
somehow this disagreement became a reason for you to leave because you have so much to give, and how much we need to be saying that to each other.
yeah, that is
So
so
often
good.
so often just thinking about ourselves, right? What we're getting, but we need to be saying to other people, I notice what you give and it matters so much to me.
Yeah, I love. Oh, that's so good. And speaking of good conversation, you host the Englewood Review of Books podcast, which is the most expensive podcast I listen to. I want you to know.
Because you're buying all
Because
those books.
exactly, exactly. But so I'm seeing you as someone kind of setting the table for good conversations, and I read your e-newsletter too, which I commend to people. And I just think you're a really good conversationalist. And I don't know, as an American who lives in Toronto, if you watched the presidential debate, which happened, which wasn't exactly a shining example of good dialogue. But I
Mm.
wondered if we could just speak to that a little bit, about how in this time we can talk well and listen even better, which it sounds like you did with your friends recently.
Mm. I love this question. And it just reminds me of somebody who's been really, who's informed kind of my thoughts about conversation is Marilyn McIntyre, who I did
Hmm,
just recently host on the podcast. And her book, Caring for Words in a Culture of Lies, is just wonderful. And I guess
love
it's
that.
soon to be re-released. Maybe it's been expanded, I think. So I definitely want to commend that to people. But one of the chapters that she has in that book is on conversation as spiritual practice. I have Until I read that book, I'd never even framed conversation as a spiritual practice. And I mean, that sounds silly because actually everything we do as spiritual beings is a spiritual practice, that is either forming us for good or deforming us, right? And when I think about conversation as a spiritual practice, when I just give it that language, it just invites me into something that is incredibly meaningful and worth investing my time in. And one of the things that I think I just have tried to practice. I think conversation is a two-way street, right? And a lot of times we think about, well, what am I going to say? And we're always thinking about what we're going to say instead of thinking about how we're going to listen. And again, I mean, Marilyn is just so good on this. She talks about the kind of deep listening that we can do, where we don't just sort of absorb what somebody is saying, but we ask further questions to sort of understand the terms that they're using or the language that they're using, or if we misunderstand something, if there's like an intention or a motivation that we want to draw out, like that, because it's hearts, right? We bring our hearts into conversation. It's not just our minds. It's not just like abstract ideas. And that probably is what goes so terribly wrong in a lot of our conversations, is that we think of them so impersonally, especially like if we're thinking about, okay, well, I'm going to have a conversation about politics, and this is going to be really hard because I think this and you think that. And now we're going to like wrestle over these ideas. And that's what happened. And, you think about social media where it's dehumanized and depersonalized even further. You don't even have the person in front of you. So it's just these words on a page. And, maybe part of the practice, the spiritual practice of conversation, is to enter it as a human being and to recognize that your conversation partner is also as human as you, made in the image of God, flawed, beautiful, not infallible, that we're limited in our perspective. So, like, if we come into conversation as humans, humans who have a whole kind of context, right? Humans come with stories. And so when I come into conversations with people, trying to get a sense of like context and story and I commit all of the sins that everybody else does. I sort of value my own opinion over other people's, and I'm very tempted to talk over other people and just to keep talking. Think about my husband, who's taught me a lot about conversation. Well, it's because he's actually very quiet. He's far more quiet in conversation than I am. And he's more reticent to speak. And I think there's something really beautiful about that, is when people leave space in conversation. Don't have to fill it up all the time. I remember I was talking to somebody years ago who said, "Wow, I kind of feel a little bit overwhelmed by you in conversation because you're just talking, super rapidly. And like, I don't even have a time to catch my breath, or I don't, maybe I'm not processing it as quickly." And so just there's patience required for conversation as we enter it differently at different, with different expectations. And wow, we could probably do a lot with just, returning to First Corinthians 13. I wonder if that would be kind of a fun exercise, and to think about, instead of, insert conversation, for all of those, conversation is patient and kind, and it believes the best and it bears all things, like good spiritual conversation having those qualities.
Yeah, that's really helpful to think of it that way. And I don't know if you've experienced this, but I have felt that in the church in particular, I am surrounded by people who want to be heard. Like, they're, I don't know, maybe they don't have people in their lives who listen to them, but I think that the art of listening is so huge. And I'm not, great at it
Mm.
either. I'm often, I just listened to a Brene Brown podcast last week, but she was talking about listening to respond. Like, I'm listening to you just so I'm already forming my, answer in my head as you're speaking. And I think that's another trap we fall into, but there'd be such a grace in slowing down and even confessing that we're doing that, and then giving
Mm.
space. And you're right, quiet people. Like, I have a daughter who has been called quiet over the years, and I'm like, well, if everyone else would be quiet
Yeah.
for a minute, we could hear her. So
Mm.
yeah, there's something very beautiful about thinking about how we talk and listen.
Mhm.
In that podcast that you just alluded to with Marilyn McIntyre, and I also love that book, Caring for Words in a Culture of Lies. And you had Lauren Winner, another author who I just love. But I definitely picked up on when you shared that the word evangelical is not a word you would use in Toronto. And you said you said something like, it doesn't mean much outside of white Republican voter in this context. And I wondered, I'd love for you to talk about that a bit more, as I guess, small c conservative Christian. I'm so leery of those labels, even as that's what we're talking about, who lives in the Canadian culture. Just how that feels for you, and what your thoughts are on the word evangelical in these days.
Hmm. I wonder if it's a little bit different, just for me being an American, so a lot of times, people are like, oh, you're American. Oh, and then they want to talk about, even though I've lived here for almost 10 years, right? But so as soon as I say I'm an American, and then as people get to know me and know that I'm, a person of faith, a person of just active faith, they just make assumptions.
Yeah.
I don't even have to use the word evangelical. I think they just make assumptions that based on what they've heard from Canadian media, which isn't false. 4 out of 5 white evangelicals in the United States did vote for Donald Trump in the 2016 election. And I think that leaves a lot of Canadians sort of scratching their heads like, how does that work? What is it about Donald Trump that, people love and support, people of faith? What is it about him? And so I think it immediately sort of devolves into that kind of political conversation, which I find to be it just is sort of a dead end, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a distraction. I mean, it's not that I'm afraid to talk about politics. I'd certainly be happy to talk about politics. I'm much more interested to talk to people in Canada and elsewhere about what it means to have a vital faith, a vital Christian faith that's not just about, Christmas and Easter attendance at services, that's actually, personal. And so that's sort of why I avoid evangelical, because I think it just connotes certain things that would be distracting. But I think in general, in the Canadian context, to talk about faith is hard, and it reminds me of, I opened my next book actually with a story. My husband and I had gone to a dinner party with one of his business acquaintances. It turns out that the woman, so the man who was the host, he's the business acquaintance. So neither of us knew the wife. And she's a writer as well, a much more prolific and best-selling writer than me, for sure. And it turned in the conversation at some point in the evening, the men split off and the women split off. And she said, Jen, what do you do? And I said, I'm a writer too. And she said, what do you write about? And which is always such an interesting
stuff.
Stuff. Like, I'd love to know, actually, Karen, how you answer that question. Because, again, the way that I choose my words is always, I'm trying to favor keeping the conversation going. It's not that I'm ever ashamed. I'm not ashamed to be a Christian. I want to just keep the conversation going. And I know how nervous it makes people sometimes as soon as you talk about faith. So I said, I'm a writer. I write about faith. I write about Christian faith. And she looked at me in horror.
Oh, no.
And she said, do you mean that you believe the Bible? And I said, I do. And she said, like Adam and Eve and Noah? And I said, yes. And she said, so like the literal Bible. And I said, oh, I'd love to talk to you about that word literal. We could really have a great conversation about that. And she just, moved on. And so it didn't even take the word evangelical. It just had to, faith, Christian faith. Oh my gosh, I'm so nervous now. Like, what does that mean that you believe? Are you really so primitive, to think that? And I don't want to, and I grant that is strange for a lot of people. So it's like the question for me is always, how do I pursue conversations? How do I start conversations? How do I sustain conversations? How do I become the kind of person that's hospitable to somebody who is really nervous? How do I make it how can I talk about this in a way that can be meaningful, courageous, but hospitable?
And that word nervous, that is very helpful, because I think we sometimes just assume hostility. We assume that they don't like us. But to think of the person as nervous as opposed to, hateful or whatever is really helpful. And I think you raise a very, very good point about, it doesn't take the word evangelical in Canada to freak someone out.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we're probably like 20 years, I don't know how these things are measured, but we are years further down the road of secularization
Absolutely.
than in the States for sure. So
Mm-hmm.
I have more non-Christian friends now than I did 10 years ago, partly because I went back to school in the
Mm.
secular program and I made some really good writing friends. And as you know, as a writer, writing friends, you tend to just, you really tell each other everything. And I mean, it gets pretty vulnerable pretty quickly when you're sharing your
Mm.
writing. So, but I did feel like I went through a process of where they, like, first there was this phase of convincing them somehow that I was not weird, like a
Mm.
real weirdo, by just sort of being normal, I guess. I mean, with them. And I think now we have a good friendship, but I love that idea of appreciating that they are nervous. They think certain things about us and they're not necessarily to be blamed for that.
No, not at all. I think that we have earned, in some ways, our very complicated reputation.
Yeah.
And I'm glad actually that you said nervous because I thought, oh, that actually is right. And the more that we can sort of lean into being hospitable to that and I guess compassionate about that nervousness and actually explicitly trying to waylay it. That's a lot of what I do, I think, in conversations about faith. Like, I know, you probably think this, or you may be nervous about that, or think that, I think the assumption is you have some, Bible or tract, in some hidden pocket. And, this is the moment that you make the sale. And I never want to tell my non-Christian friends that I don't care about where they stand with faith, questions of faith. I think these are ultimate questions, and I want to be in conversation about them. I also want to constantly trust God that um, he will do his work, right? And that as I continue to try to be the sort of person that is as hospitable as Jesus, I mean,
Mm.
in the Gospels, he's so incredibly hospitable. And the way he holds conversations with people is so masterful, right? Built so much on questions more than kind of
Yes.
these like emphatic declarations. I want to grow to model that and to live that way and to trust that God will do his work through that.
Well, I think we all want to know, though, what happened at the dinner party.
Yeah. Well, the conversation sort of ended there, and I
Okay.
ended up feeling like, oh, I wish I could have said something more. But interestingly enough, when she was showing us out the door, because the men and the women had split up, and there was another couple there actually too. She was showing us out the door, and this was the first time that we were sort of together again. She turns to her husband and she said, "Did you know that Jen's a believer?"
Oh, no.
I thought, well, yeah. So you never know. You never
Yeah.
know what may come of that,
Right.
And so again, it's illuminating to me. I always take those kinds of conversations like, what can I learn from that? What I can learn is again that nervousness, that fear, that real kind of like palpable fear. Oh my
Hmm.
goodness, you believe these things. Aren't those so hurtful and harmful in the world? As Christians, as soon as if we could just understand that that's sort of behind a lot of what you would say we characterize as hostility. Wow, we could get further in our conversations with people who don't share our faith commitments.
Jen, thank you so much. This has been so fun for me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Karen.
Thank you for listening. Check out more podcasts and subscribe to Faith Today magazine for free at faithtoday.ca. This podcast is produced by the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. If you enjoyed it, please rate or share it.